The other thing that's great about Shota, I mean, these decks are all awesome. He's always showing up with something interesting. It's also, they're all his. It's not like he had the whole team of people. He's the lone wolf. He just kind of disappears between Pro Tours and comes out with the best decks.
Overlord of the Huntwoods, just deciding whether or not he wants to go for it here.
He is going to go for it. It's going to trigger up the Beanstalk. Does it resolve?
Well, the thing is, he's got a cut down here for the Fairy Mastermind that he anticipated. So now, before the card draw, he's going to kill the Mastermind and get the combination here. This is the reason why Channel Fireball chose to play this deck. Seth now has the mana advantage, the card advantage.
That is a ridiculous start.
Yeah, and this is exactly
the deck coming into the tournament, but this might be a breakout deck. It is those Izzet colors. It doesn't have Quarry Steel Cutter or some of the other cards that we are expecting from Izzet, but it is still a powerful Izzet strategy.
And I think one of the cards they...
Deck building in Magic is a highly intricate and complex task that can be kind of daunting for new players. In this video, I am going to review several aspects related to deck building to hopefully guide you through this complicated process and give you the confidence to sculpt your own works instead of just copying others. Before getting into specifics, I want to start with some basics and also some more broad qualities that are really pinnacles when it comes to Magic the Gathering decks. So of course there are 5 colors in Magic: red, green, white, blue, and black. These 5 colors are not only going to dictate what cards are going in your deck, but they're also going to dictate the feel and how your deck actually ends up playing out, and also just what kind of deck you're making. Throughout all of Magic's 32-year lifespan, there's always been this kind of give and take between different types of decks. It really is this kind of competitive dance that you're having with your opponent. Each type of deck has decks that it plays really strongly against, but then also ones that it has a bigger challenge going against. A good analogy for this is the game Rock, Paper, Scissors. Obviously, each one of those options beats one of the others, but then also loses to one of the others. Decks in Magic kind of fall into a similar vein, but it's not exactly the same. There are really 3 overarching archetypes that cover pretty much every single deck that has ever been made. Maybe a more fitting word is structure or framework as opposed to archetype. Those 3 structures are aggro, midrange, and control. These are effectively the rock, paper, scissors of Magic, whereby each structure tends to have one that it performs really well against, and then also one that may be a greater challenge. The 5 colors just innately fit into these same 3 structures, and the colors tend to fit better into certain structures and not as well into others. For example, red is a very common color associated with aggro decks, and rightfully so, to the point where a quintessential aggro deck throughout pretty much all of Magic's history has been mono red. You can make an aggro deck full of just red cards, but you wouldn't make a control deck that was exclusively red. Red can be a complementary color used alongside something else. Conversely, blue is not historically an aggressive color. You would not be able to make an aggro deck full of only blue cards. But blue is typically used in control decks. In fact, it's not uncommon for it to be the base, and then you have some other colors to go alongside it. Here's an interesting little piece of Magic lore for you. In the Dominaria set, there was a card called Wizard's Lightning, and the text reads, "This spell costs 2 less to cast if you control a wizard, and it does 3 damage to any target." There was also a card called Wizard's Retort, and that text reads, "This spell costs 1 less to cast if you control a wizard, and counter target spell." Well, if you look at the mana cost of these 2 cards, Wizard's Lightning is 2 colorless and a red. Wizard's Retort is 1 colorless and double blue. If you control a wizard, then for each card, the colorless cost is removed, leaving you with only 1 red and 2 blue, which mimics the cost of Lightning Bolt and Counterspell, both of which have the same effects of the 2 wizards cards. Both Lightning Bolt and Counterspell are pillars of Magic, being featured in the very first set released alpha. But it goes a bit deeper than that, since this kind of summarizes the play and counterplay of all of Magic. One player is going to initiate an action, and then the other player is going to have to respond in some way. The flavor text of both of these cards is also pretty interesting. Wizard's Lightning reads, "The study of magic began when the first mage taught herself to throw lightning," implying that magic started with lightning bolt. The flavor text of Wizard's Retort says the second mage learned to dissipate blasts of lightning, threat and response. Thus did the study of magic progress. Pretty cool, huh? Now each framework comes with its own strengths and weaknesses. Any deck that you make is probably going to fall into one of these three frameworks. Aggro decks will try to play multiple threats early on in the game, and then try to finish things off before the opponent can stabilize. However, if the opponent does stabilize, then the aggro deck might run out of juice and not be able to finish the job. Mid-range decks will typically showcase some kind of board presence with powerful cards or powerful combos. This allows them to build up over the course of a few turns and then eventually just overwhelm the opponent. However, it also means that most of the win conditions rely on only a few key pieces, so if those key pieces get removed, then suddenly the deck isn't very powerful anymore. Control decks are built around inevitability. These decks attempt to mitigate whatever threat the opponent is presenting, and then close out the game once the opponent has exhausted all of their resources. The primary weakness for control decks is that they can sometimes just be too slow, and then the opponent gets off to too strong of a start, and then they're not able to deal with enough of the threats. If you take a step back and think about these points, then you can kind of see where this rock, paper, scissors analogy comes from. Aggro decks have a higher chance of winning against control decks, but not necessarily mid-range decks. Mid-range decks have a higher chance of winning against aggro decks, but not necessarily control decks. And then control decks tend to have a higher chance of winning against mid-range decks, but not necessarily aggro decks. This is a really important thing to understand because depending upon which of these structures you're going to build, you want to figure out how you can include some pieces that are going to help you in your worst matchup. Let's talk generally about an aggro deck as an example. The aggro deck should be structured in a manner that it consistently performs pretty well against control decks because it will get off to a strong and fast enough start that the control player will not be able to mitigate all of the threats before their life total reaches 0. Conversely, an aggro deck will typically struggle against mid-range decks because the mid-range decks will be able to put things on the board to prevent the aggro player from getting damage through. To that end, the player utilizing the aggro deck should try to include some pieces that will allow them to get past the mid-range player's defenses. Now I'm going to return to these points once I start discussing specific decks so that you can have some concrete examples. But I'm intentionally structuring this video in a manner that should mimic your own thought process when building a deck. You'll want to start broadly by considering what type of deck you're going to make and what are the general strengths and weaknesses of that type of deck. Once you are ready to start thinking about these specifics, there are some general guidelines to help you with that as well. So let's start getting into those now. For this next segment, I'm going to switch over to MTG Arena since I'm going to be talking about specific decks, and I really like the interface here, and I think it's going to help a lot with going through these specific examples. Once you have a good idea of the type of deck you want to make, there are a few other things you want to consider before choosing specific cards, such as which colors are you going to be working with and which format are you going to be playing in, including if you're going to play best of 1 or best of 3, because that's also going to affect which types of cards you're going to be using. Once you're ready to start building with specific cards, it's important to categorize them. And to walk you through this, I am going to use the big bad boogeyman of standard right now in the form of the Is It Cauldron deck. The first category of cards you should be focusing on is the core. The core is going to consist of the most important cards in your deck. They should be cards that synergize well with each other and promote the main theme of the deck that you're making. What I'm going to do here is rearrange these cards so that the core is separate from the rest of the main deck list. Here I have the core of the deck on the left, and then the next column are some additional non-land cards that serve as utility cards. I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit. And then the last column consists of interaction. Looking through the cards that I have put here, you can see how the core of this deck functions so well together, which is why this deck is so strong right now. There's a couple themes here with this core. One of them is +1/+1 counters, so the Mako gets counters, the Prof, the Agatha Soul Cauldron, and the Vivi. All of these add +1/+1 counters to creatures in some way. Another theme is drawing and discarding, so the Mako benefits from cards being discarded, but itself also has cycling. Prof allows you to draw cards, but then also benefits you for drawing more cards. Fear of missing out draws a card and discards a card. And that synergizes with the last theme, which is using the graveyard. So if you discard a Vivi and then you can put Vivi in the cauldron, then anything that has a +1/+1 counter on it is going to get Vivi's activated ability. This core is a big reason why this deck is so strong. It synergizes extremely well together, and it has multiple pieces that possess a lot of potential. This is what you want from the core of your deck. It should synergize well with itself, but then also consist of a lot of your power or a lot of your important cards. In this particular case, there are 4 copies of each of the core card, but that is not a necessity. You can do it with only 3 copies of one of them or 2 or whatever. You could have a 5 or 6 mana card that is part of the core of your deck, but you don't necessarily want 4 copies because you don't want having multiples of them in your opening hand. You'll also notice how there are 20 cards here consisting in this core, and that's a pretty good number for what you want to shoot for. Typically about 15 to 20, maybe a little bit more than that in some occasions, but what that means is that approximately half of the non-land cards in your main deck list are part of your core. That's what you should be aiming for. Once you think you have your core ready to go, you're going to want to move on to adding some utility cards and some role players and some cards that are going to support your core. These cards should also ideally synergize with the mechanics of the core cards. And that is certainly the case with this Is It Cauldron deck. Steam Core Scholar, Winter Night Stories, Tersa Light Shatter, all of these fit in with the same mechanics of the core. They're allowing you to draw and discard. So you can buff your Mako, you can trigger Prof, and you can also put cards like Vivi into the graveyard to hopefully put it into the cauldron. The fact that Winter Night Stories and Wild Ride both have Harmonize adds into this even further, because if you need to discard something, well, if you discard something with Harmonize, then you can still use it. Quantum Riddler has been seeing more play in these decks, and it's a really good fit. When it enters, you draw a card, so that can trigger Prof, but also if you warp it, then you can use it to harmonize Winter Night Stories. It's a really good play because then you only need 1 blue source to be able to recast Winter Night Stories from the graveyard. Now, one thing about the utility cards is that you typically don't want too many 4-ofs for these cards. In this case, having 4 copies of Winter Night Stories certainly makes sense, but otherwise, if you run 4 copies, you might actually be limiting the potential of your deck because this is kind of a flexible slot. If you have 4 copies of multiple cards, but you're treating them as utility cards, then you need to start asking yourself, well, am I making this a utility card or is it becoming part of my core? And if it's part of my core, is that a good thing? You're also going to want to be a little bit careful with the cards that you include here because you want to avoid any assynergies. And I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later with some additional examples. At this point, once you've sorted out your core and you've sorted out your role players, utility cards, etc., then you should have about 6 to 10 card slots still available, maybe about 5. And that's where you want to put your interaction. You simply will not win as many games if you have 0 interaction in your deck. You need to have something. Choosing which interactive spells to include in your deck can be a little bit tricky, but it's going to come down to a few things. One is that it's going to depend on which of the 3 structures of deck that I mentioned earlier are you making. In this case, Is It Cauldron is a mid-range deck. It can sometimes feel like it's an aggro deck, but it's not really. It's more of a combo mid-range deck that takes a few turns to really set up and then make some big plays. The other thing to consider is what is happening in the current meta. The other top decks in the meta are the ones that you're more likely to play against, so your interactions should support your deck in a way that addresses the primary threats of those other top tier decks. That's why the Is It Cauldron decks and other decks that run red have started to include copies of a Braid in the main deck list, because the top deck right now is It Cauldron, and the Cauldron is an artifact that is one of the most important cards in this deck. There's other artifacts that are common as well, and even in most sideboards are Ghost Vacuums or Pinnacle Star Cages or something like that, all of which can be addressed with a Braid. It's also why a lot of Is It Cauldron lists have started to main deck more copies of Steam Core Scholar, because the second most popular deck is Dimir Midrange, so Steam Core Scholar is a good blocker against those flyers. Also, since mid-range decks tend to have an issue facing up against control decks, including the copy of Wild Ride is a way to get around that by giving your creatures haste. It allows you to take advantage of a turn when the control player is tapped out. Now that being said, a big reason why the Is It Cauldron deck is so successful is that it's actually not that weak to control decks, because anything that goes in the graveyard could potentially just be put into the Cauldron, especially a VV. Casting Get Lost or 3 Steps Ahead on VV potentially helps the Is It Cauldron player. So the aggro decks are not able to punch through damage early because there are creatures that can appear on the battlefield, as well as some cheap interaction. And the control players can't just keep removing everything, because if VV ends up in the graveyard, then VV can potentially go in the Cauldron. Now the last thing to sort out in your main deck list is going to be the lands. This can also be a tricky process. It can be more complicated than you might expect. Effectively, what you want to do here is look at 2 things: the mana requirements of your cards and the sequence that you're going to play them in. You want the mana production to support the mana requirements as best as possible, especially when it comes to the core cards. The core cards are the most important. If you look at the mana requirements of this deck, it is evenly split between red and blue, and then there's an even amount of production between red and blue with the lands as well. Then you just want to make sure that you're maximizing the potential of having the color that you need on the turn that you want to cast something. That's where you want to think about the sequence of the cards you're playing. So with this deck specifically, I'll sort out the cards in the order that you might want to play them. Generally speaking, this is kind of how it goes. Obviously, you can play into the Flood Maw at pretty much any point if you have blue mana available, but as far as what you want to be putting on the board, this is kind of the order you want to be playing it. Ideally, you start with a Mako, and then turn 2 you play either a Proft or a Fear of Missing Out. Then any one of these is good to play on turn 3. You're probably not going to want to play a VV on turn 3 unless you're okay with it getting removed because you have a Cauldron in your hand as well. Similarly, you're probably not going to want to play a Cauldron on turn 2 because it could potentially get removed before you can take advantage of it. If you notice, the earliest turns are slightly more red, which means that the mana production should hopefully make red early on in the game. That's why Riverpire Verge really works in this deck, because it starts as red until you get an island or mountain. Now, once you're nearing this point of having 60 cards in your main deck list, you're going to want to take a step back and really think about how does this deck actually win the game. Remember that mid-range decks attempt to have a strong board presence and then use powerful cards or powerful combos to overwhelm the opponent. That is exactly what Is It Cauldron does. Powerful cards, strong board presence, and a very powerful combo. So this deck happens to have multiple win conditions. You can win off of a Prof, buffing your creatures. You can win off of Cauldron and VV as a combo together and being able to draw through the deck. You can even potentially just win off of a Mako, growing more every single turn. Or win off of the Delirium trigger from Fear of Missing Out. Having multiple win conditions is very important for a mid-range deck. Because again, the main vulnerability of mid-range decks are losing those key pieces. So if you lose one of your key pieces, do you have a backup plan? Do you have some insurance? Do you have another way to threaten your opponent? Now, if you're playing best of 1, then once you get to 60 cards in your main deck list, then you don't need to go any further. But even if you plan on playing best of 3, before you jump into working on the sideboard, there's something else that you can do. This actually comes from a user by the name of Disgusting Act who left a comment on my Sultai Dragons video. What he said is, I always brew in best of 1 to get a higher volume of games in and then work backwards to convert to best of 3. That is a brilliant idea. Trying things out in best of 1 will give you an ample sample size to see how well the core of your deck is working. You don't need to fuss too much about the utility cards and the interaction until you feel confident and comfortable with the core. That being said, if you are planning to play best of 3, then you are going to need to also develop a sideboard. The sideboard is just as crucial as the main deck list, so if you are planning to play best of 3, you need to look at your deck as a 75 card deck instead of a 60 card deck. In a similar manner to the interaction in your main deck, your approach to the sideboard should be dependent on what type of deck you are making and what is happening in the current meta. Since artifacts and enchantments are very popular in the meta right now, it makes sense for the Izzet Cauldron decks to include a couple copies of Annul. Since Dimir Midrange is the second most popular deck, it makes sense to include copies of Fire Magic. Since mid-range decks tend to have trouble with control decks, it made sense to include a copy of Disdainful Stroke. Broadside Barrage, Negate, Obliterating Bolt, these are all pretty good against control decks that might play bigger creatures, but also pretty good in the current meta when you have some big creatures or some big planeswalkers like Kaido. And lastly, a few copies of Rawl, because again, planeswalkers are really good against control decks. They sit underneath sweepers, they are harder to interact with, and if Rawl's just making you an otter token every single turn, and then you're just casting non-creature spells every turn and giving him more loyalty counters, then the control player is going to be underneath a lot of pressure. All of this just makes sense. It lines up with the fundamentals that I was explaining earlier on in the video. You need to be a little bit careful with your sideboard because you want to consider what are you going to substitute out to put some of these cards in. When you do that, you do not want to compromise your deck. You don't want to make your deck weaker, you don't want to dilute it, and you don't want to limit its potential. To that end, in most cases, you're not going to want to touch the core of your deck when you're sideboarding. In the case of the Cauldron deck, there is an exception because if you go up against a mirror match, many players will remove multiple copies of VV so that there isn't the risk of your own VV going in an opponent's Cauldron, which makes sense. It can be very easy to accidentally overboard in a matchup where you're putting in tons of cards, but then you end up weakening your deck. To help you with this, there is something that you can do. Once you have an idea of what 15 cards or what potential 15 cards you want to put in your sideboard, write them down. Then start writing out a few tables. Each table is going to represent a matchup against a common deck in the current meta. You should have about 5 or 6 of these tables or so. In each of these tables, write in which cards you're going to substitute in and which cards you're going to substitute out. Again, be careful when you're doing this to try to not compromise your deck. Once you have done that and all of your tables are filled out, you should then cross-reference with the original list of the sideboard that you made. Start looking through each table and put a check mark next to each card in the sideboard list that is included in your substitutions for these matchups. After you've done that, if there are any cards in your original sideboard list that do not have a check mark next to them, those are ones that you should potentially take out and replace with something else. Furthermore, there's another layer that you can do with this. Once you start playing matches, if you get a game against one of the matchups that you wrote in a table, you should make those substitutions. If the substitution proved effective, then you can put a little star next to it. You might not get to do it all, but again, it gives you a sense of how well your sideboard is performing. Then you can look through your sideboard list and you should see check marks and stars, check marks and stars. At least hopefully as many that you can end up noting. So that summarizes the key approaches when it comes to deck building. You want to have a core, you want to have some utility cards, you want to have an interaction, you want to have mana production that satisfies your mana requirements, and you want a sideboard that is going to be flexible to address the current meta and the potential weaknesses of the type of deck you're making, without diluting the power of your deck or limiting its potential. What I want to do now is move on to some other types of decks and show you how the same approaches apply in those different cases. This is an Azorius control deck, and control decks are obviously very different from mid-range decks. The same things apply here. You want to have a core, you want to have some utility cards, and then you want to have some kind of interaction or just some cards that do something a little bit different from the rest of the deck. Obviously, control decks don't show a lot of board presence early, and they don't play a lot of creatures or anything like that. So how can a control deck possibly have a core? Well, to answer that, I'm going to ask you another question, which is, what is the control deck trying to do? The control deck is trying to mitigate and address threats, so the core of the deck should mimic that objective. So, looking at the cards in front of you, what do you think are the core pieces of this deck? I'm going to sort these cards in the same manner I did for the Izzet Cauldron deck. This is the core of any control deck. It is all of the cards that allow you to interact with the opponent. It's much different from other decks because other decks will have interaction as a secondary thing, whereas it's the primary aspect of any control deck. You have multiple ways of mitigating and addressing the threats between counter spells and removal spells, and some of those removal spells are sweepers. All of this synergizes really well with itself because it's all directed at the same objective: to deflect and diminish threats until your opponent has run out of resources. Now, the utility column of a control deck is pretty interesting as well, but the primary utility spells are going to be card draw effects, because those are going to allow you to keep digging through the deck to keep finding more answers to more threats. Beza is also an extremely good utility creature, in fact really one of the best utility creatures in the entire format. He can potentially make a treasure token, gain you some life, make more creatures, or draw you a card. He buys you time and then also gives you some more resources to use. To that end, Overlord of the Mistmoors does a similar thing by making these 2 tokens that can block creatures. But Overlord is also extremely good top end for this deck because of the synergy with Elspeth. So ideally, once your Overlord is done impending, or maybe it's later on in the game and now you can hardcast it, then you are able to start applying pressure on your opponent. To that end, Meringue River Regent is not only a good utility creature with the Coil and Catch, he is also very good top end because having a 6/7 flyer that bounces 2 permanents can potentially just turn the game completely in your favor. One of the main things that is a bit deflating for Azorius control decks right now is actually the mana production, because there's no fast land and no Hallowed Fountain either. But that's a little bit balanced out by the addition of Seamrip, because Seamrip being white means that if you have a Flood Farm Verge in your opening hand, then you can start with a Seamrip potentially. Now, one of the points that I made when discussing the Izzet Cauldron deck is that you need to adjust your deck depending upon the current meta. That is doubly important for control decks, because the control deck is trying to respond to the primary threats, and the primary threats that potentially exist is going to depend on the current meta. That's why a lot of Azorius control lists have started to run more copies of Day of Judgment, since the format is a little bit faster, and waiting on 5 mana to play your sleeper is sometimes just a little bit too slow. Furthermore, a control list is going to be very different depending upon best of 1 or best of 3. When playing best of 1, it's likely that you're going to want to main deck a few copies of Authority of the Consuls, potentially also Pinnacle Starcage. That's because the best of 1 format is much more aggressive and the decks are much faster. When playing best of 3, it's not as necessary to include those cards. Also, with the Pinnacle Starcage, it's very vulnerable to Abrade, which is very common in best of 3. The sideboard, of course, just like any sideboard, needs to adapt with the meta. That's why there's copies of Annul. That's why there's copies of Rest in Peace. That's why there's a Devout Decree, because it exiles VV. Tiebinder, a similar thing. It's going to stop any of the triggered abilities in the Cauldron deck. It can also stop triggered abilities in the Dimir midrange deck. Ride's End is still very good at dealing with aggro decks, which again is the primary difficult matchup for control decks. The key thing here is that it doesn't matter if you're making an aggro deck, a mid-range deck, or a control deck. You should still have a core, you should still have some utility cards, and then you should still have some cards that provide some additional flavor, either in the form of interaction or in the form of some powerful top end. Let me move on to an entirely different example. This is a Selensya aggro deck that was actually put together by Mythic Mike. If you are not already subscribed to Mythic Mike, then I highly recommend that you go check him out. His decks are just awesome. It is a deck built for best of one, so there's no sideboard here, but it's another interesting example to look at that follows these same principles that I mentioned. Here's how I would lay out the deck according to the principles that I mentioned before. Since it is an aggro deck, it wants to try to play a creature every single turn, and it wants to try to hit for a lot of damage. Turn 1 Llanowar Elves is a very good start for an aggro deck, as is a Paw Patch Recruit that has Trample, and then also has this added ability to make your creatures even bigger. The Bunnycorn is a card that's going to get bigger every single turn if you keep putting permanents onto the battlefield. Well, creatures are permanents, so every single turn, this creature is just getting bigger. Warden of the Grove not only gets bigger itself, it makes other creatures bigger. And then of course, Ouroboroi is one of the most busted cards in Edge of Eternities. Easily the best green card, and honestly just one of the best cards in the whole set. The utility creatures here are what I would consider to be the Novice Inspector and the Gene Pollinator, and it so happens that Mike has 4 copies of each of these. As I said before, you do want to be careful with including 4 copies of your utility creatures, but in this case it really does work. Novice Inspector is not only a 1/2 body for 1 mana, which is great for an aggro deck, but it also makes a clue when it enters. The clue is another permanent to buff the Bunnycorn even higher. Furthermore, it's a permanent that can be tapped with the Gene Pollinator to produce more mana to get more creatures on the field early. That mana can also potentially be used to offspring the Paw Patch, and now you're just getting even more creatures. The interaction in this deck consists of 4 copies of Seamrip and 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. Obviously 2 really good pieces of interaction, but they also synergize with the rest of the deck, because since these are both permanent types, they buff the Bunnycorn, and then they're also permanents that can be tapped with the Gene Pollinator. This is just an extremely efficient and synergistic deck. That's typically what you want with your aggro deck, and especially what you want in best of one. Now that being said, the primary weakness of aggro decks are that they can run out of steam, and this deck is no exception. There's no card draw engines in here or anything like that, so as soon as you play out your hand, you're just top decking, and if you haven't won the game, then you might not get what you need to close out the game. But that's actually fine for best of one. That format is a little bit faster than best of 3. I don't think that this deck would perform very well in best of 3. It would need some adjustments, and of course it would need a sideboard. But it's a perfect example of a deck that knows exactly what it is and exactly what it's setting out to do. The next deck I want to discuss is Dimir Midrange. This is the deck list that I showcased in my last video, but there are a few key points here that I want to make. There's a key thing that you want to keep an eye out for when you're building your decks, and it's something that you want to avoid. That is asymmetry between your cards. You don't want cards that are doing opposite things or just fighting against each other. And so many Dimir mid-range deck lists right now are running 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat. There is a big asymmetry here with Deep Cavern Bat and Kaito, because you don't want to take something from an opponent's hand and then ninjutsu in Kaito to take your bat back to your hand, but then give them back that card. If Deep Cavern Bat is the only creature you have on the field, then that is the only creature you can potentially ninjutsu in Kaito, and ninjutsuing Kaito in on turn 3 is one of the primary win conditions of this deck. That's another key point that I want to make about Dimir midrange, which is understanding what your win condition is. The win condition with Dimir midrange is getting ahead in tempo and doing chip damage every single turn, doing 2, 3, 4, 5 points of damage every single turn. Kaito is the turn 3 power play. It is one of the best plays you can make in the entire format on turn 3, next to like putting VV in a cauldron, you know what I mean? So it is so important to maximize the potential of that huge play. Hence why there are other flying creatures in here to try to get in for damage that are unblocked, that are going to allow you to ninjutsu in Kaito. Furthermore, I see deck lists that are running 4 copies of Preacher and only 3 copies of Kaito. That again makes no sense. Preacher is not the win condition with this deck. You would much rather on turn 3 have an unblocked creature so that you can ninjutsu in Kaito as opposed to just playing a creature on the field. It's an example of procrastinating, and you don't want to procrastinate your win condition. You want to maximize the potential of your win conditions to use them to the greatest effect. I've noticed another deck that consists in a synergy, which I want to highlight. That deck is Boros Dragons. Mono Red Dragons is a pretty popular deck right now that seems to be the leading aggro deck, but this one has also been gaining some traction. The thing is, there is a huge asymmetry in this deck, and I don't understand why people are not taking more note of it. The key concept of the deck is this: you have Sarkhan in hand, and then you can behold one of these dragons to make a treasure token. Magda also makes treasure tokens, which is pretty easy when you have Hired Claw and Burst Lightning, Plasma Bolt, or Nova Hellkite, or Twin Moss Stormbrew, right? All of these things commit crimes by targeting something that the opponent owns, and that allows you to make a treasure token. However, aside from Twin Moss Stormbrew, in the Boros colors, there's not really a good option for a white dragon except for Clarion Conqueror. Now, Clarion Conqueror seems like a really good dragon. It's a 3/3 flying body for 3 mana that also prevents the activated abilities of artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers. Sounds pretty good in the current meta with Dimir Midrange and Izzet Cauldron running all over the place. But the thing is, treasures have activated abilities. They're artifacts with activated abilities. You have to tap the artifact to add the mana. So if you have Clarion Conqueror on the field, all of a sudden your treasure tokens are useless. Making the treasures allows you to get out these bigger dragons earlier. You can potentially put out a Twin Moss Stormbrew a few turns earlier, or just put out a 5-mana Nova Hellkite on turn 4 or whatever. And even if you've already done that, then anytime you make a treasure with Magda, well, if Clarion Conqueror is on the field, you can't use that treasure anymore. It really just doesn't make sense. There is some possibility here that maybe you already used the treasure from Sarkhan and now you don't have any, so then you can play the Conqueror. But if your Sarkhan gets removed and then you try to play another one, Behold a Dragon, I mean, that's great, but now that treasure again is useless for as long as Clarion Conqueror is on the field. Again, it's just things to look out for. You need to be careful that your deck doesn't have any asymmetries, or if it does, are they detrimental to your deck, or can they just be worked around, or they're not such a big deal? Another deck I want to discuss is my Esper Pixie build from a few videos ago. This list that I put together is noticeably different from other Esper Pixie deck lists, primarily because of the mana production and turn sequencing that I mentioned earlier on. Storm Chaser's Talent is the best 1-drop for an Esper Pixie deck, and I still stand by that. However, other deck lists run 4 copies of Storm Chaser's Talent, 4 copies of Spyglass Siren, multiple copies of Stock Up, copies of Fear of Isolation, and with that much need for blue, I found that the mana base right now was not able to support that with the absence of Azorius Fastlands and the absence of Hallowed Fountain. So instead, I started to lean a little bit more black by including copies of Spiteful Hexmage and then also a copy of Elegy Acolyte. Furthermore, another issue that I found with the sequencing was including the copies of Stock Up in the main deck, because this is not the thing you wanted to be doing on turn 3 with this deck. It's just a dead turn and you're not showing any board presence. That's not what a mid-range deck wants to do. A mid-range deck wants to have board presence within the first 3 turns. And I think that's even more so important with this Esper Pixie deck, because Pixie and Kieran and some of these creatures, they're not very powerful. So it's important to have presence early on in the game so that you can get some tempo going. That's why I moved the 2 copies of Stock Up to the sideboard in case I need them for extended matchups. Now, as I mentioned before, mid-range decks tend to rely on key pieces to make big plays and then eventually overpower the opponents. The key piece here is Cosmic Grand Zenith. But one of the faults that I found with this deck is that if Cosmic Grand Zenith gets removed, there's not really anything else that the deck can do to close out games. That's what led me to work on my Orzhov brew, which includes copies of Unholy Annex as another win condition, and also a card draw engine. However, there's another Esper Pixie deck that I want to show you, and it kind of solves these problems that I mentioned. That deck list comes courtesy of Doomwake, one of the best content creators in Magic the Gathering that you can possibly follow. And he came up with this list for Esper Pixie, and he ended up winning his RCQ with it. It addresses many of the faults of the Esper Pixie brew that I showed you before, and many of the faults of other Esper Pixie brews. There is now another win condition alongside Zenith in the form of Kaito. By running 3 copies of Kaito, you could potentially get him down on turn 3 or even on turn 4, and that's going to get you a lot of momentum going. It doesn't include copies of stock up in the main deck. Those are in the sideboard, just like what I said before, because that is not the thing you want to be doing on turn 3. You don't want to tap out with just a stock up. Furthermore, he very tactfully addresses the primary poor matchup for mid-range decks, which are control decks. He does so by including more cheap spells to get board presence earlier on in turns 1, 2, and 3. This puts more pressure on the control players and then also has more bodies on the field against aggro decks or other mid-range decks. I would sort out the core of the deck as follows. I would put Pixie, Storm Chaser's Talent, Kieran, and Zenith as the core, and then the rest of these as either interaction or just support creatures that synergize well with the core. Really clean and solid deck list that just highlights many of the key points that I mentioned. The last deck example I want to showcase is this very interesting 4-color control deck that was put together by Shahar Shenhar, a retired pro player who now streams on Twitch and uploads to YouTube. If you are not following him, this guy is so insightful. He gives such great commentary on his games. Pretty much exclusively plays best of 3 as well, so if you are a fan of the best of 3 format, then he is a very good resource to check out. The reason why I want to show this deck is that it actually has a very interesting win condition. The win condition is actually more of a burn strategy using Lightning Helix, Inevitable Defeat, and Jeskai Revelation. All of these cards can do damage directly to an opponent. Lightning Helix can do 3 damage. Inevitable Defeat does 3 damage. Jeskai Revelation can also do 4 damage, or you can do it to another target as well. But really, there's ways of getting more value from this deck. It has mystical teachings in it. This can be used to potentially find one of these instant spells if you don't have enough. Sphinx of Forgotten Lore can do a similar thing. It can pull one of these things out of the graveyard so you can replay it. Just a really cool and interesting deck. I think one of the big reasons why this deck can potentially be so successful is that it addresses a key pitfall of control decks, which is that they're slow, and it allows some space for aggro decks to get in for tons of damage. Well, these 3 removal spells and burn spells, if you want to call them that, they also gain you life. Lightning Helix gains you 3 life. Inevitable Defeat gains you 3 life. Jeskai Revelation gains you 4 life. So if you're taking damage early on, you can actually potentially buy some time by just removing your opponent's creatures and then also gaining some life, or just doing some damage to them directly and gaining some life. Now that being said, because it's a 4-color deck, one of the primary things that could be a challenge is the mana base. It does feel like, though, with the Shocklands that we have available to us, that running 4 colors is not necessarily an unfeasible thing to do. Very cool and creative deck that again addresses one of the key pitfalls of control decks, which is losing life early on. I'll close out this guide by highlighting a few of the key points. Remember that you want to start broad and then figure out the specifics later. Which of the 3 deck frameworks do you want to start building in? Aggro, mid-range, or control? What is the format that you want to play in, and are you looking to play best of 1 or best of 3? Once you have a sense for where you'd like to start, then you should move forward with developing a core, and this core should include cards that synergize well with each other. The utility cards and the interaction, that stuff can be sorted out later. You should then ask yourself if the mana base available reasonably fulfills the requirements of the spells that you're trying to play, especially in the core of your deck. Then once you start putting together a list of multiple cards, then you should take a step back and consider what is the win condition of the deck and how are you going to sequence your turns to maximize the potential of the most important cards. If during the process you feel like you're missing something or you're not really sure how to round out the 60 or the 75, then you can always potentially do some research to see if somebody else built a similar deck and see if that gives you some ideas. Use existing lists as a basis for what you're trying to do. But that does lead me to a final thought that I want to pose, which is why build original decks at all? What is the point of trying to come up with your own ideas and your own stuff when there's so many resources available and you can just see what other people are doing and then use it yourself? Well, part of the joy of Magic really is going through the arduous process of creating something. It's fun and interesting to try to come up with your own ideas and then put them into something real. It's also a mentally engaging challenge that facilitates your creativity. It serves as a vehicle to exercise your brain. To that end, deck building really can feel like a form of art. And truthfully, it is immensely satisfying when you come up with your own stuff and you figure out something that works. There's also this larger rippling effect where the more people that try to experiment with their own decks, then it prevents a format from becoming stale. And I think this perspective is epitomized in a recent clip from Dev of Strictly Better MTG.
We as the player base also have a responsibility to try out, play with, experiment with new stuff and old stuff for that matter to make sure that nothing's passing us by. I have the deep-seated anxiety of wondering whether every single standard season that goes by contains dozens of cards that we as a player base just never give enough of a chance. How many cards have come and gone in standard, got printed and then rotated out a couple of years later and never truly got the shot they deserved? They were waiting the entire time to be the best deck in standard and we just never unearthed it. I worry about this constantly and there's nothing we can do about the cards that have already passed us by, but the cards that are still in standard and aren't getting enough attention, those we can try and save.
Definitely a sincere sentiment to have. I hope you all have enjoyed this deck building guide video. If you found it helpful, then drop me a like to beat the YouTube algorithm. Drop a comment to share your feedback or your own tips and suggestions for deck building. And lastly, if you are a fan of this kind of cerebral Magic the Gathering content that gets deep into deck building and deep into card synergies, then subscribe to the channel to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.